Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Wisconsin Health News virtual panel on what's next for psychedelic medicine. My name is Tim Stum. I'm the editor of Wisconsin Health News. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a really great panel with us today to talk about this important and emerging topic. I'm thrilled to introduce Paul Hutson, director of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances, John McCorvy, Associate Professor of Cell Biology, Neurobiology, and Anatomy at the Medical College of Wisconsin, Chantelle Thomas, Executive Clinical Director for Windrose Recovery, and Sean Kirkby, Senior Editor of Wisconsin Health News, who is moderating today's event. Before we get started, I want to make sure we thank our generous sponsors of the Wisconsin Health News virtual series. Healthcare leaders from across the state sign up to watch these virtual events, and they would not be possible without the generous support of these sponsors. So a huge thank you to Aurora Healthcare, AARP Wisconsin, Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Wisconsin, Delta Dental of Wisconsin, Amplify Health, Marshfield Clinic, Gainwell, and RSM. Wisconsin Health News is an online, nonpartisan news service. In addition to hosting events like these, we also publish a daily email newsletter. If you're not yet a subscriber, I encourage you to sign up for a free trial, which you can do on our website at wisconsinhealthnews.com. And an extra thanks today to AARP, today's featured sponsor. We're really grateful for their generous and continued support. Here to say some words is Raj Shukla, State Director for AARP Wisconsin.
Thanks so much, Tim, and thank you to Wisconsin Health News for inviting us to be a part of this series of important discussions. My name is Raj Shukla. I'm the Wisconsin State Director for AARP. We're one of the most recognizable brands in the world, focused keenly on ensuring everyone can choose how they live as they age. I'm fairly new to the organization myself, having joined after a career in environmental advocacy. But aging parents brought me face to face with the range of issues around caregiving that exists. That includes the limitations of current medicines to help with all challenges that we all inevitably face. Our focus at AARP Wisconsin is in three big areas: financial security, including protecting seniors and others from financial fraud. We're also deeply committed to ensuring our communities are built for all people of all abilities, making sure transit is freely available, safe housing is plentiful, and public spaces are accessible. And finally, we hope to shine a light and bring resources to caregivers across the state. That includes reducing the financial burden that the million or so caregivers in Wisconsin face. It also means supporting efforts of organizations like Wisconsin Health News that are bringing together researchers and practitioners who can provide more options for all of us to manage the inevitable care that we all need in life. Many thanks to our panelists, Chantelle, Sean, John, and Paul, and the team at Wisconsin Health News, Tim and Sean, for making this possible. I hope you enjoy the next discussion, and I look forward to it myself. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much, Raj, and thanks again to AARP for all the generous and continued support. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean to lead today's discussion.
Thanks, Tim. Psychedelic substances have drawn renewed attention from researchers and regulators in recent years as promising therapies for certain mental health conditions, decades after they were dismissed as having no medical value. Our panel is going to take a deep dive into this topic and the role Wisconsin's playing in this emerging field. And to that end, I kind of like to hear from folks how they kind of got involved with studying these treatments. Paul, maybe you could start us off and talk a little bit about your story into this field.
Thank you, Sean. So about 13 years ago, I was approached by Bill Linton from Promega, now the CEO of USON Institute. He had a neighbor that went to Johns Hopkins to be treated with psilocybin in one of the earliest studies that is, you might call as in the renaissance of psychedelics that started around the late 1990s and went into the early 2000s. She was dramatically improved. And so he wanted to bring this kind of research to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he supported our first clinical study of psilocybin about 10 years ago now. And that study was a safety study looking at dose escalation of psilocybin. And the reason that I got into it was that I had some experience with the safety studies in the cancer therapeutics realm, some experience with setting up studies with the FDA on experimental investigational drugs. And so I sort of backed into it based on my background with clinical trials and cancer therapy. And we've been active ever since.
Can you talk a little bit about the center that you direct? What is the University of Wisconsin-Madison Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances? How did it kind of develop?
Well, we actually had several studies going on before we created the center, but we realized that at the University of Wisconsin campus, we had multiple individuals in multiple different schools that were interested and engaged in this area. And so we felt that it was important to create a center where we might find some symbiosis, where we could have a more centralized resource for these researchers. And that includes not only the School of Medicine and Pharmacy, but School of Nursing, Engineering, the Latin American Caribbean Iberian Studies program, and the School of Education. And so we've tried to create this center where there is a better understanding of what resources are available. One of the things that we are thinking about is shortening the name. So I'll be honest with you about the fact that we were a little bit concerned about having psychedelics in the name 10 years ago, and even 5 years ago when we started the center. And I think we're to the point where we can say the P word now. And so
Well, great. So John, could you talk a little bit how you got involved in research in this field? What brought your attention to this subject?
So I think a lot of my interest stems from growing up. So I grew up in Texas, in Austin, Texas, which was sort of a hub for psychedelic recreational use. But also, Texas has some cultural underpinnings in terms of using just natural psilocybin mushrooms culturally. And my parents were, brought up in the 60s. And so essentially they had experience with psychedelics, and I didn't really know what the substances were. Contrast that with what I was seeing and experiencing when I was a young child of also drug abuse, and in particular cocaine, and then soon to be methamphetamine. I was interested in these psychoactive mechanisms of actions, and I was trying to understand what drove people to do habitual drug use. And it seemed like psychedelics were somewhat didn't fit the category of a drug that was taken sort of, for recreational, euphoric type purposes. That brought me to some philosophical questions like, how do these drugs work? And so that led me to, try to find labs for graduate school to study for people who had expertise in psychedelics. That brought me to Purdue University to work with David Nichols. And David Nichols at the time was a handful of researchers that was funded by the National Institute of Health to study psychedelic substances. And in fact, some of the studies that Paul is alluding to at Johns Hopkins that was using psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, was being made in Dr. David Nichols' lab at Purdue while I was a student. So that really cemented my role in trying to understand how psychedelics work and potentially understanding their therapeutic effects, which I'm hoping we can get into in terms of some of the mechanisms, but they are emerging as a class of drugs called rapid-acting antidepressants. And ketamine is another example of these types of substances that, and again, approaching sort of FDA approval is something that we should talk about in terms of whether it's a one size fits all or whether it's specific for particular indications. So since then, since I came to Medical College of Wisconsin, Milwaukee in 2018, I have a basic science research lab, mainly on understanding how psychedelics elicit their effects on brain receptors, serotonin receptors. And then also part of my lab is interested in drug discovery and fine-tuning substances and maybe even taking out a lot of the psychedelic effects from those substances.
When it comes to MCW's role in this, is there a similar center as UW? How many folks at MCW are involved in this type of research?
Very few, but again, we're sort of growing the basic science arm of that. And then, of course, Paul and I have talked about maybe sort of creating some sort of consortium to where researchers are both interested in the same types of questions, in particular for substances that are not psilocybin. So, for instance, there's other substances that are psychedelics like 5-methoxy-DMT, LSD, and the new ones that are also making progress in clinical trials and trying to understand how they're different from psilocybin, but yet they act on the same receptors. So yeah, some of the science and the questions seem to be converging in terms here in the state of Wisconsin.
Thanks, John. Chantelle, can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in this field? What led you to uh, uh, study, psychedelic treatments
hmm
and also be a guide for these experiences?
hmm Yeah, I was working at Access Community Healthcare Centers. I'm trained as a clinical health psychologist, and I was working here in town at our federally qualified healthcare centers with a clinician by the name of Dr. Randy Brown, who's an addiction medicine doc and a family medicine doc. Um, and I always had an area of specialization in the treatment of addiction and also trauma related work. But Randy essentially approached me and said, we're looking for psychologists to do some screening for a psilocybin trial, which is the one that Paul was referring to, that initial pharmacokinetic study. I knew nothing about psychedelics in a therapeutic sense. I knew nothing about them in a recreational sense. I did not come into this work through a psychonautical pathway. More so, I was really interested in the idea that potentially people could work at a deeper level with the assistance of the non-ordinary states of consciousness that are occasioned by psychedelics. And so that's how I led my way into it alongside of my husband, who's also a neuroscience researcher, works with Paul as part of the center at UW and is a PI on many of the psychedelic studies. He's also a clinical psychologist, and he and I both started working on that trial in 2013, kind of in a similar way, doing screening for that trial and then also facilitating, and our path continued to expand.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of facilitator within these therapies? I mean, for folks who are unfamiliar, what does that
Mhm.
kind of mean? Like, what role
Mhm.
are you playing here in helping people receive care?
Well, I will say that the role of the facilitator, or even what they're called, will change across different studies depending on how they're defining the role. So I worked on trials alongside of my colleagues. UW-Madison was one of the sites for the phase 3 trial for treatment-resistant PTSD with the inner-directed model that was put forward by MAPS, and then supported by Lycos, and then Resilient. But essentially, you can be signified as a therapist in the room. In some instances, you're there purely just to kind of hold space and make sure the person is safe. But your level of involvement and your intention alongside of the compound that's being administered will look really different across different trials. But I would say the unifying principle is the idea that we recognize that these compounds bring about big experiences that carry a lot of emotion. They can often be very challenging for individuals. And that ability to kind of go deeper into the consciousness and kind of get into deeper content that may be very well compartmentalized, or we're in the Midwest, which is like masterful skills of compartmentalization, and people not wanting to move into conflict, and those things really come up in big ways. And so really your role as a facilitator is to help people, one, really understand what they're consenting to. The informed consent process is really important. Many of the people that we treat and we don't treat, that we work with in these trials, because there's a difference between research and treatment, have never had an experience with the psychedelics. So they don't know fully what they're consenting to. There's this big wave of enthusiasm in the media about this being a silver bullet or a fast track for healing. And so we have to do a lot of careful, deliberate preparation to make sure they understand what they're consenting to, and that this particular experience is well aligned with their internal psychological resources, their support system, and that we're calibrating expectations in a way that really allows them to be prepared to really not expect anything they can predict, which is, so I always say we're consenting for uncertainty. And then during the experience itself, we're there to be, I would say the role of a facilitator is fairly complex, even though sometimes people say, you're not doing therapy necessarily. You are really trying to help people navigate safely the choices that exist to them during those sessions. And then also really non-judgmentally holding space for whatever comes up. And then on the back end, we're helping people make sense of experiences that might be completely awe-inspiring, completely confusing, horribly disappointing, and everything in between. So that's really feels like a really critical component alongside of the compound itself.
One of the only, I think the only currently allowed psychedelic treatment outside of like a clinical research situation in Wisconsin is ketamine-assisted therapy. Can you talk a little bit about how this therapy work? What impacts do folks see from this treatment?
Mm-hmm. Well, the next caveat I'll say is it depends what version of ketamine you're talking about, because ketamine is administered in many different ways. And essentially, I often refer to it as ketamine the chameleon because it's a completely different drug depending on how it's dosed, the dosage range itself, the route of administration. So whether it's the nasal spray, which is the Spravato, versus an infusion clinic versus taking a lozenge of ketamine that is alongside of a therapeutic process. So the complicated answer is that it actually looks really different depending on what you're trying to target. The most researched area of ketamine is infusion therapy for depression and treatment-resistant depression. That's really a model where people are using it as a psychopharmacological alternative to an antidepressant that is dosed 1, 2, 3, up to 6 times, typically in infusion clinics. And they're just looking for rapid antidepressant effects that kind of happen to a person, as opposed to when people are actually being prepared to interact with the subjective experience of ketamine and use that subjective experience to therapeutically do something different inside, not just purely relying on the chemical signature or the cascade that's occasioned by ketamine as a compound, but using it as a therapeutic catalyst to kind of go deeper, explore something differently, or maybe even amplify the traditional psychotherapy that they're already doing because they're feeling stuck or something isn't moving or they need a deeper level or newer level of insight around something.
Got it. One thing I was wondering if you could talk a little about too, Chantelle, but you mentioned before your involvement with some of the research at
Mm-hmm.
UW. What have these
Mm-hmm.
studies kind of looked like? What have you all been involved in studying?
Well, it's been a lot in the last 13 years, and we've looked at phase 1, phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials for depression. We've actually looked at substance use disorders trials that are actively recruiting actually for an opiate use disorder along the lines of psilocybin and methamphetamine use disorder. For psilocybin, like I mentioned before, we had MDMA for PTSD. We've also been a trial site for 5-MeO-DMT for depression. So I would say, generally speaking, the most studied areas are depression, trauma, and substance use disorders, is what I would say. And then we have a series of mechanistic studies that are really interesting that are ongoing right now, where we're trying to understand the role of memory and trying to understand what are the kind of components of that experience and how does it work and how does it impact meaning or purpose that might come from these. So there's been quite a range, and certainly the PTSD results, despite the FDA not approving MDMA, which was a difficult determination for a lot of people in the field, but definitely kind of raised a level of scrutiny of safety, questions about ethics. But the trial results themselves were quite staggeringly positive for PTSD for people who'd been, on average, I think, in regular treatment for up to 15 years without really being able to move that needle. We saw a significant shift for those people in the PTSD trials. And there's been breakthrough status associated with the depression indication, which we're going to see very likely an NDA, maybe the end of this year or into next year, that's coming off of the Compass data. And then the substance abuse trials are kind of following right behind that, is how I think about it or talk about it.
Thanks, Chantelle.
Mhm.
Paul, can you talk a little bit too about, some of the studies are underway? Are there some that UW is pursuing that you're particularly excited about?
Well, yes, there are several. Chantal mentioned our study that's applying psilocybin-assisted therapy to individuals that have a methamphetamine use disorder, and we had some investor money that was short-lived, unfortunately. But in the 3 subjects that we were able to treat who had a methamphetamine use disorder, we had a 90% drop in their methamphetamine use after 2 doses. So 90% drop, just amazing. We're seeing that also in other studies, other groups looking at tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, and we also, as she mentions, have that opioid study that's similar, using psilocybin-assisted therapy to try to um, divert individuals from using illicit opioids. But the other ones that you mentioned, we have one that is kind of novel where we're administering intravenous psilocybin to individuals who are sleeping. We have to give it intravenously because we can't wake them up, give them a pill, and assume that they're going to go back immediately to sleep. So we're looking at how it differs when we give it intravenously to individuals who are sleeping versus who are awake, and looking at the EEG patterns, their perceptions of the significance of the experience, if they recall anything. We had a few patients who, or not patients, we had a few subjects who in our pilot study woke up, but we were relieved that they didn't wake up in any sort of distress. We had therapists or facilitators there immediately at hand, and we just worked them through that experience as they woke up. So we're looking at some really interesting mechanistic studies, but I want to call out John is doing some really fantastic work at MCW as well, in vitro, looking at his both in vitro and animal models that is really pushing the envelope as well.
John, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the biggest question that we have in my lab is what psychedelic is appropriate for whatever mental illness or drug abuse, because there's several different kinds of psychedelics. So Chantelle mentioned ketamine. That doesn't work on serotonin receptors like LSD and psilocybin does. But again, they do kind of converge on what we're studying, what they do to neurons, which is what's called neuroplasticity. So they cause neurons to actually form new growth and make new connections. And that mechanism is at the heart of this rapid acting effect to change behavior. So we're trying to understand what are the signaling pathways from these serotonin receptors, or in the case of ketamine, which works on glutamatergic NMDA channels, and trying to understand how we can't fine tune these types of medicines. So while the clinical trials are looking at known substances, known psychedelics, psilocybin, 5-methoxy-DMT, LSD, we're really trying to understand what are these mechanisms doing in terms of forming new connections neuronally. And yeah, so the other half of my lab is trying to understand how we can apply those mechanisms towards something like methamphetamine abuse, which is also, we have an NIH grant to understand. We are modeling that in rats using a paradigm, an assay, where rats are basically trained to infuse methamphetamine. The reason why I think this was important on the NIH list of things to treat is because there aren't any good medications for stimulant use disorder such as methamphetamine. And some of them just don't work. Because you can imagine methamphetamine is a stimulant, people still try to be productive, but essentially they are sort of shackled to that substance to be productive. And I've met many methamphetamine users, and it's a cycle of their behavior of being, integrated into society, going to work, and yet still being dependent on that substance. So we're trying to understand which psychedelic is the best to treat that, at least at the neuronal level. What are the signaling mechanisms we need? And then a really exciting question is, do you even need, which I think Paul's studies are trying to address, do you even need that psychedelic experience to see the benefits? Or do you just need the neuroplasticity to form the connections? Kind of like what ketamine does. Ketamine is typically classified as a dissociative. So essentially there is not a lot of consciousness going on with that substance. So can you design a psychedelic that targets a serotonin receptor that kind of does the same thing? Is the memory formation, the experience itself, inherent in trying to unpack some of the trauma and looking at the behaviors to sort of modify your future behavior? So those are the types of questions we're trying to do in the mechanistic animal behavioral models.
John, you mentioned earlier that you were looking at forming a consortium with Paul. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how widespread is this type of research in Wisconsin? Is that going to be the focus of the consortium, or is it going to be wider than that?
So hoping that it can be wider, and essentially that clinical trials here in Milwaukee can also be, this population could get access to some of these trials. But again, on the basic science level, the questions that still remain, there are researchers such as Cody Winther over at UW-Madison that are trying to answer some really key questions, especially what's happening in terms of psilocybin administration at different phases, in particular in pregnancy. So all of these questions are trying to address some of the safety issues regarding psychedelics. And of course, what we do is we're real interested in the signaling and the receptors that are involved and about whether you can fine tune those receptors towards to avoiding those types of effects. A really important example is that some psychedelics do activate a key serotonin receptor in the heart that can cause overgrowth of the valves, and that's called cardiac valvulopathy. So that's something my lab has spent quite a bit of time to try and understand. Is this still a risk in terms of people taking psychedelics? Is this should be towards, filtering out and screening patients about with any type of underlying cardiovascular disease? Also, psychedelics do tend to increase blood pressure and have increases in heart rate too as well. So again, as Chantelle was saying, maybe it's not a one size fits all for a particular psychedelic, but maybe other psychedelics may be safer, but it really depends upon if it has efficacy towards that particular clinical indication.
Can
Thanks.
I jump on that one, Sean,
Yes,
as
for
well?
sure.
I agree with John, especially the cardiomyopathy concern. And a lot of people are interested nowadays in microdosing of psychedelics. And the definition of what that means, whether it's a subperceptible dose or just a little sparkle, differs from one person to another. But there are no data yet that argue that psychedelics, psilocybin or LSD, are any better than placebo. Yes, both placebo and LSD seem in microdoses to improve cognition, but you can't tease them apart and decide which one is acting. So there's no clear benefit of LSD microdosing or psilocybin microdosing. And there's this concern about this receptor on the heart valves that may be stimulated to cause this cardiomyopathy. And without any evidence of benefit and this potentially life-threatening side effect of microdosing, chronic microdosing, we can, I think at this point, firmly say don't microdose. There's no evidence for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not to mention hypertension, right? That's another thing that happens for folks as they are taking these subperceptual doses. Maybe they're experiencing some subjective benefit and they haven't gone to their doctor and taken their blood pressure in quite some time. And they show up for a checkup and the doctor is basically saying, like, what are you doing differently? And then people are nervous to talk about it. So then they don't share that information. I've had my mom reach out to me, say, asking me questions about things she hears in news articles. So I do think it's really important that we're advising people to be really careful and safe in their practices.
And that kind of makes sense because a lot of the psychedelics that target the serotonin receptors, serotonin, the reason why it was named is because it was the substance that's found in the blood that induces contraction of
Mm,
vessels. So
mm,
indeed, like one of the key receptors in the brain that causes some of the changes in consciousness is also present throughout the vasculature and can cause hypertension and basically increase in blood pressure. But
mm,
again, some psychedelics may be much safer in that regard and they may
mhm.
have activity at other receptors that can actually dilate the vessels and reverse the high blood pressure. So again, understanding exactly the physiological symptoms of psychedelics needs to be taken into account.
Mhm.
John, could you talk maybe a little bit more about this? You mentioned this concern about the cardiovascular side effects. What other sort of side effects are tied, and what are some of the risks of these treatments?
So again, there's a lot of psychological risks. For example, schizophrenia. So people who are prone to psychosis. So most of the antipsychotics are designed to block these serotonin receptors, not activate them like what psychedelics do. So you can imagine someone who may be prone to psychotic episodes that may actually exacerbate those types of psychotic symptoms. So again, I'm not a clinician, but I think for sure that if there's a patient history of some sort of psychosis, or maybe in terms of facets of bipolar disorder where they may have mood swings, this may be an indication that it could probably worsen those symptoms.
Mhm.
Um, when it comes to the Chantel, when it comes to the benefits of these psychedelic treatments, like what are they? What the mental health conditions are they good for?
Mhm.
And I mean, do you have anything else to add to what concerns might
Mhm.
arise from receiving these treatments?
Mm. Well, again, I'll underscore, like, it really depends on the compound that you're talking about and where most of the research lies, right? But for example, because ketamine is available and it's talked about a lot and it's growing in some popularity in terms of people thinking about it as an alternative treatment. People are thinking about it most often for depression, but a lot of the ketamine clinics will talk about off-label uses, such as using it to treat OCD or anxiety or substance use disorder, which I will say ketamine in particular, I think it's also another good thing to just be naming. While it potentially, I mean, it has these miraculous anti-suicidal effects, which we don't have a pharmacological drug in our current armory of interventions that has the kind of anti-suicidal effects that ketamine does rapidly. Most of the antidepressants that are prescribed, they take 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks to reach potency. And sometimes they come with an increased risk for suicidality, which is interesting, right? Whereas we see this impact on suicidal thinking that seems almost to stand independently of the antidepressant effect, which is just remarkable, right? So people think about ketamine infusions maybe as an alternative to very invasive treatments such as ECT for really treatment-resistant depression. So I do want to name that there's tremendous promise there. There's also, kind of this reset that people experience with something like ketamine, again, under the right set and setting and circumstances. But ketamine is also like a very slippery fish, right? It's not very clear exactly. There's a lot of things about it that don't entirely make sense for people who are using it, even in controlled settings. And sometimes people may not get a benefit from it because they're not being prepared sufficiently for it, or maybe there's other sub-threshold diagnoses that run alongside of it, like John was referencing bipolar, an untreated or undiagnosed bipolar disorder. You add ketamine to that equation, it could spin someone into mania, which could be very dangerous. Or if someone also has a substance use disorder, they're not disclosing there are addictive properties to ketamine. That's really more in a recreational setting, but we don't fully understand the implications of waking up kind of those pleasure reward pathways with something like ketamine that can cause some euphoria when it's not done in a controlled setting where there's not a therapy alongside of it. And so I would say for people with substance use disorders, to have a lot of caution exploring these kind of things, unless it's done in a therapeutic container where there's a therapy alongside of it that's getting amplified or kind of worked alongside it. And for people with trauma-related conditions, just going into an infusion clinic, where unfortunately a lot of the time there's not someone sitting with you in those clinics. You're experiencing ketamine, but you're not necessarily there with a therapist. You're not necessarily even there with another person. They check on you, they leave the room. People can re-experience traumatic memories alone while they're being hooked up to an IV pole, which can be a really terrifying thing. So I do think it's really important to recognize kind of the conditions alongside of that are happening. And I think it's incredibly important to be able to kind of do your research and ask questions about it and not just presume because this is a breakthrough treatment for some people that it's going to be necessarily appropriate for you.
Yeah, and let
And
me
I,
just sort of, oh, sorry,
no,
just
go
sort of
ahead.
dovetail on that about the
Yeah.
substances, because I think what she's keying into is that these are substances, unlike other medicines, that are set mindset and your setting and your surroundings dependent. So every experience may be different depending upon that mindset that you go into. So if there is a trigger that you've had at least recently in going into the clinic and receiving that substance, you may be more prone to sort of re-experiencing that. And then maybe a question for the panel is about, trying to understand the facilitator's role a little bit more clearly in these types of settings, and especially with the adjunct psychotherapy to help sort of unpack that, because these substances will lead you to certain brain pathways where you may not want to open those doors. And once when the drug is having that effect and those doors are opened, there are a lot of things to unpack, not only during the experience, but also the days afterwards, after the experience.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think that is one of the key things that I try to drive home for people is that using these compounds in a recreational context, they functionally almost feel like different experiences. In almost all of the trials that I've worked on, we have this focus on using them in an inner directed way. And what that means is most of the time in the clinical trial settings, and even in my clinical practice with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, people are using these compounds with their eyes closed or with eye shades on. And the idea behind that is another way that we think about these psychedelics is we call them non-specific amplifiers. So something about the non-ordinary state of consciousness kind of goes inside someone's system and it turns the volume up on something. Now, you can theorize if you believe in kind of the inherent healing properties of these compounds, maybe they're turning the volume up on something that needs attention, that needs healing. Some people don't view it that way, but it's important to recognize that whatever is getting the volume turned up on, that can be happening in a way that feels really helpful, but it can also happen in a way that feels really difficult or challenging or emotionally terrifying even at times. So I think it's really important to recognize that this experience of doing it with therapy support or facilitator support. I mean, I worked on the MDMA trials and people, they were astounded that it was the same drug that they had tried once in their 20s or something. Cause they're like, I can't even believe this is the same compound. Same thing for ketamine, right? You have kids who, unfortunately end up in bad pathways with ketamine, snorting it or abusing it. And then they use it in a therapeutic context and they're astounded. And even clients that I've worked with who've had substance use histories find ways in the right container, set and setting with the right therapeutic support and think like, wow, I cannot believe that this compound is the same one that my cousin abuses, right? Like, how are we getting these dramatically different effects? So I think just to make it all more mercurial and confusing for people, it's really important to ask questions about what preparation looks like, what the facilitation looks like, what's the container that it's happening in, and what's the therapy that might be alongside of it.
And these types of concepts fit with the neuroscience about what types of receptors they are activating. For example, most people associate these with sort of conscious experience, things they have consciousness of, like how are you feeling and whatnot. And these receptors indeed are located on the cortex that you have conscious access. But these receptors are also located in deeper brain areas that you don't have consciousness access to. And again, sort of what Chantelle was saying, that there's a lot of things that get brought up to the surface in terms of past memories, past childhood and whatnot. And the activation of these receptors in these other areas are constantly free flowing with what you have conscious access to. So it is quite a bit of an unpredictable manner, but with sort of goal-directed behavior in the context of the session and trying to understand what you're trying to address in terms of your mental issues. This is where sort of they can sort of break free from other traditional type of medications. And just to point out, the issue with first-line therapies such as SSRIs and other, these take weeks and months to work. And maybe we could talk about some of the treatment-resistant issues around those, because many people try these treatments for years and or decades and never really see the clinical benefit unless they're on the drug. With these substances, it's still being worked out, but with an acute use of just one time or two-time use in the clinical trials, the effects are long-lasting. The question now is, how long-lasting are they?
Let me jump on that a bit, Sean, as well. So you've heard from both John and Chantal that this is not, this kind of therapy is most effective when it's done in a fashion that includes informed therapists or monitors, psychologists, or other healthcare providers that have a sense of what the intention was and what to expect, what to anticipate in these sessions. So we're about a year away from psilocybin perhaps being approved by the FDA. And one of our big questions is going to be, how do we provide this access to these therapies, as dramatic as they are, in places other than Milwaukee or Madison? How do we provide the skilled screening that needs to take place to make sure that we don't treat someone who should not be treated with these drugs? How do we make sure that they are attended by individuals who can help provide the psychotherapy that accompanies the drug effects themselves? And this is going to be a huge challenge because we don't have enough mental health care workers at present to handle the mental illness that and the substance use disorders, the PTSD that we're faced with in the state. And the FDA currently requires in research settings to have two therapists in the room with the person for the full 8 hours of the dosing session. And it's going to be very, very difficult with that model, if that's what the FDA imposes upon us, for us to have the capacity to extend this to other parts of the state. Now, it may be that we can use one person in the room and have another person available in case they have to go to the bathroom, for example. But what level of training, of skill, of experience these therapists, monitors, guides need to have, whether or not it's mandated by the FDA, is going to be a really important question, because as Chantal's alluded to, the needs of the are going to differ from one person to the next, one diagnosis to the next, and one drug to the next.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of the FDA doesn't regulate therapy, right? And so this is another really complex and challenging issue is they might approve a drug and have no opinion whatsoever about what happens alongside of that drug, which is essentially an interesting component about how ketamine got approved with Spravato. Like there's no requirement for psychological support, or there's no requirement for psychotherapy alongside of it. It's a purely medicalized model. And so I think people have a lot of concerns about the medicalization purely of these compounds and not taking into account the way that they kind of shake things up as part of the mechanism of maybe what's working. I mean, one way to think about conditions that are really deeply entrenched, like depression or even PTSD or substance use disorders, it's like you're stuck in this loop of thinking in the very same way, and you just can't get out of that groove. Whatever, if you want to mentalize that in the brain, it's like one pathway that you're just like looping and looping and stuck in. And okay, so like amazing, a compound comes along that potentially bumps you out of that groove, but then what, right? That moment where you get bumped out could be, holy smokes, I've never thought about it in this way, but it can also be terrifying to all of a sudden think about your entire life in a new way or in a different way. And so that's that piece of integration that feels really important. And I think when we just rely on a model that looks at these compounds just happening to people in a very passive way, we're kind of missing an opportunity, which is the part that I find most exciting, is not the idea of like using these compounds over and over again, but the way in which they mobilize potential for hope or agency or the capacity to feel like you have a choice. And then how does that get then galvanized and not just relied upon to kind of just act upon the person over and over again, which I think we see sometimes in ketamine models that for my purposes, I'm not the most delighted about, which is just continuing to administer ketamine consistently over time, as opposed to using ketamine to kind of create a breakthrough window that can then be fortified and galvanized by behaviors or therapy in a different way. And so that's really a tension that I hold around all of this is how will we use these effectively as catalysts, primary interventions when absolutely necessary, where someone can't engage in therapy, and then what is everything else that falls in between in terms of what are the opportunities there.
We're kind of talking about some of the challenges that are facing this field. Paul had mentioned the accessibility issues and the need to have these kind of treatments, and Chantelle talked a little bit about some issues with recognizing the variety of treatments and like what's out there in terms of how much you administer and other things. John, are there other sort of challenges that are potentially throwing barriers up to either wider acceptance of these treatments, or what are some of the challenges beyond those that we've already talked about facing the field?
Well, we kind of covered some of the safety challenges, right, in terms of trying to understand what are some of the underlying conditions, whether those are mental or physical. But I just want to point out that, each of the psychedelics within the serotonin class can be quite different in terms of their experience. So, for instance, we've been talking about psilocybin, which roughly lasts between 4 to 6 hours. So having that time, and during this session, people are completely aware and having strengthening of synapses and forming memories around this experience, which is very unlike ketamine, right? So, and this is why it's a key question about whether you can remember these types of experience. But then there's another psychedelic that's in clinical trials called 5-methoxy-DMT, and it does not last hours. It's on the relatively short time scale, 5 to 10 minutes. And again, that is also showing some enormous effects in lots of different conditions. And a couple companies are running those trials. So again, the question is which one is probably going to be right for you? Do you want to have a short, intense experience like with 5-methoxy-DMT? Or do you need more time or sort of built into the experience like with psilocybin? And then also to contrast that with an extreme example is LSD. And many people are familiar with LSD in terms of our culture. It's a very long-lasting psychedelic. And in fact, the pharmacology of it, which we've extensively studied, activates many different receptors that may be even beyond the psychedelic experience. And so understanding how the properties of something long-lasting like that is there's some issues with that. Most people can't sleep after an LSD experience. And in fact, it does have some stimulant type properties. So you can see each one is sort of, different in the way that it's sort of manifesting itself, not only psychologically, but towards this longer term type of effect. And so that's a big question that we have in terms of studying the substances. Which one is tailored best for this medical indication that you have? And it's not quite, clear because we've sort of called it like it can treat a lot of different things. And really, we need to try to figure out what are the conditions, how does this match up with the neuroscience? And more importantly, what I want to get across to everybody is what is the future of this? We've been studying substances that are hundreds and thousands and millennia old. What can we do in terms of a next generation medicine to make some of these substances even more effective and to reduce the side effects? And that's a primary goal of my laboratory.
It's kind of looking towards the future, at least in the short term, and maybe not looking in the same direction that you're looking, John, but like the regulatory aspect of this. Paul, you had mentioned that we might see psilocybin approval by the FDA soon. I think there's some frustration among folks who have worked in this field that the Trump administration hasn't moved as quickly as some would have hoped, given Health Secretary Kennedy's interest in some of these treatments. What do you see coming down the pike for approvals? And do you share any frustration that it's taken this long to get a wider acceptance of these treatments?
Well, so you're asking a couple of different questions there. One, are we frustrated about the rate of acceptance? I think that the acceptance of the research has been quite good. The FDA has not been obstructive. The DEA has not been obstructive. There are some additional hoops to jump through to work with a substance like LSD or psilocybin, but our relationship with the DEA and the FDA has been very, very good, I would argue. There has not been the funding for clinical research from the NIH that we would have hoped, but funding from the NIH, quite honestly, has been dampened in the past year or so across the board. So we're just one of many concerned about funding. In terms of how fast it's been put through the approval process, I don't know that it's really been held up. Psilocybin has breakthrough drug status for 3 different companies. LSD has breakthrough status for anxiety, and for hydroxydiisopropyl tryptamine that John mentioned earlier has just recently, within days, been given a breakthrough drug diagnosis for the study of postpartum depression. But all of these are proposed uses. And when you say acceptance, I think that there is acceptance of the huge potential for these drugs to have a dramatic effect on depression, trauma, substance use disorders. But we still don't know yet how to best use them. Like the studies that are probably going to be approved by the FDA next year are likely to be 1 to 2 doses, as John mentioned earlier. We don't know if that's enough. We don't know how long that is going to last. We don't know if a booster dose at 6 months is going to maintain it better, or if we should just wait until people start having symptoms again. We don't know yet how to use these drugs optimally. And these are the drugs that we're more familiar with. And as John mentions, we've got other drugs that are coming down the pipeline that are more synthetic, perhaps more focused, if you will, in their mechanism and their receptors. And we're going to have to figure out how best to use those, how to compare them against the first time, the first approvals like psilocybin and MDMA. So I can't say that there is a lot of foot dragging by the FDA. I think that between the loss of staff that they've suffered in the past year and the increased concern about safety that Chantelle mentioned and ethics, how we do this in an ethical fashion, all these questions are causing the FDA to take a step back and take a look at what it is, what the criteria are that they're judging. There's a lot of enthusiasm to get these drugs on the market as soon as possible by a lot of people, and I give the FDA credit for maybe being a wee bit too cautious, but I respect that. I respect their caution.
I mean, I'll
And,
add to
and
that just a little bit before you do, John. Um, uh, I wish that the FDA scrutinized other drugs in the same way that they're scrutinizing these drugs.
Fair
Like,
point.
there are
Fair point.
so many drugs that get released onto the market with very few long-term follow-up studies. I mean, and they just get poured into the doctor's offices and people get placed on them forever. And there are real risks to long-term antidepressant use that we're not even beginning to understand in terms of discontinuation syndrome and people never coming off of them. So like, I appreciate what Paul is saying. I think caution is certainly warranted. The frustration that I have is that the FDA is not best equipped to be able to evaluate some of those risks when it comes to the psychotherapeutic and ethical concerns that are emerging. And so we get this weird kind of diluted alarm that doesn't necessarily send the full message to the public, which is the part that I have lots of concerns about implementation of these compounds. But I'm not sure that the overarching message that everyone got around the MDMA being denied was, you ask 10 different people why it got denied and you get 10 different answers. So like it only confused the public in a lot of ways, which is really frustrating because it is really important that we educate the public about what's happening. So I do think there's that component. You know, the USONA trial, Paul, I'll just mention this, that's going on right now, the phase 3 trial for depression, is actually looking at redose protocol. So it's actually looking at what happens when you give someone a second dose, a third dose, you know, depending if the depression symptoms are still. So we're going to have some good data that will be coming out from that. I think the other piece here is this idea that it's a really tricky thing to take a compound that is kind of turning treatment on its head. You know, many of these classic psychopharmacological agents are in some ways about restricting emotional access range, not expanding it. And so we get people feeling more than they ever felt before, as opposed to kind of clipping emotional range. And then we've got this weird thing of like, okay, you don't do it continuously. So now we have this big question, like, how many times do you do it? And how many doses are there? And really looking at those studies, like Paul's speaking about, you know, really a strong desire for implementation studies. And my biggest fear is they won't happen and they'll just get put out there and they'll get approved. And then you'll have lots of people kind of trial and error guessing. That's what we see with ketamine a lot of the time. People are just like, oh, you're not responding after 4 doses, let's give you 4 more, as opposed to someone saying, well, maybe we need to relook at this. So yeah, just wanted to enthusiastically put that out there. John, sorry to clip you on the front end.
No, I think there's a lot of issues in terms of FDA approval. I think as a scientist, we want FDA to be objective in approving, but that requires data and research. And again, as Paul mentioned, the research opportunities seem to be shrinking lately, especially not only at the clinical trial level, but also at the basic science level. We need basic science, sort of what my lab is interested in, to help the clinicians guide the clinical trial design, especially when it comes to new substances. Again, there are so many companies that are involved with creating a next generation psychedelic. And again, they take up my email box and asking some of these key questions. But we can't answer those unless those have funding behind them, which will help train scientists in my lab and clinicians and people here in the state of Wisconsin. And again, most of this funding comes from the National Institute of Health. So having a funding platform is really important to keep the momentum going. And then again, if FDA does have more data to objectively say that, yes, this is approved, I'm hoping that will sort of melt away some of the stigma around psychedelics. But again, every psychedelic is quite different. So we need a lot more data, a lot more scientific studies to really decide, okay, so this is the psychedelic that you take for this particular treatment, and this is what you expect a year out, 2 years out. We're not quite there yet, and I do fear that maybe we won't have enough funding to do that. Again, just to say, a lot of people, these breakthrough statuses for psilocybin analysis, these are based out of companies. Companies require their own fundraising in the private sector, and the private sector is heavily dependent upon what we, as federally funded investigators, what we publish.
Yeah.
So if they don't have data and papers to look at to sort of decide what route they're going to do for a strategy of making a new drug, well, then they're just shooting in the dark and they're likely to fail, like most drugs fail.
Agreed.
So we're approaching the end of the webinar, and I guess sort of as a final question, what are you all kind of looking when you look at the next 5 years in this field or so? What are kind of the major milestones or things that you're watching that are coming that you're either really excited about or that people kind of need to know about? Like, what is kind of like the next major events in this field? And Paul, would you like to start off?
I'm excited to hear what John and laboratories like his come up with in terms of targeted drugs that may make these sessions more effective and also faster, less demanding of the kind of support that we give them now. Um, I'm also excited to learn how we're going to be able to extend this, increase our capacity to dose people outside of the medical centers. Um, but I think that really I'm most excited about what is coming out of the laboratories, both Cody Winthers here at the UW and John's in MCW. There's a lot of really exciting insights that are going to guide the next drug that we're going to be working with down the road.
Thanks, Paul. How about you, John?
I'm excited that, if there is a milestone, a flag planted that FDA does approve a psychedelic, and that most of those mechanisms are tied towards activation of key serotonin receptors, that this will go beyond psychedelics, and maybe that type of mechanism can be applied towards other types of drugs. For example, there is a way you can take or reduce the effects of psychedelics by reducing the activity at some of these receptors. It's a concept called partial agonism. So I'm already seeing in the biotech space that people are like, oh, okay, we want to actually tickle that receptor and activate it partially so that we can actually add on antidepressant effects to other medications. Because for decades, it's been you should block the receptor or don't touch it. So now we're finally focused on serotonin receptors as being, bona fide drug targets for a whole host, not only mental health disorders, but also inflammation, pain, other areas where serotonin is throughout the body. It's in the gut, it's in the vasculature, it's in the blood, it's in the brain. So this really helps put the focus back on these targets.
Thanks, John. And Chantelle, will give you a last word.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about the possibility of psilocybin's NDA forthcoming. I mean, and also what happens with Resilient in terms of what they do with their MDMA application. I mean, there are so many conditions that we could do better with. I'm also really hopeful about substance use disorder research, and I hope we can really continue to push that through. That methamphetamine use disorder study that Paul was referencing earlier was my favorite study to work on. These were people that many instances never touched treatment because the stigma was so high. I have a deep passion around substance use disorder treatment and the trauma that co-occurs with it. And we just need to do better. So I'm really hopeful at the possibilities of what could come with this, with more research in the substance use disorder domains. And I mean, it would shift the entire landscape of healthcare if we could move the needle in a different way with substance use disorders. So that's what's on my radar.
Well, great. Well, thank you all so much. This is a really great discussion, really great panel. Appreciate all your expertise. Our next event is going to be March 10th in Madison, looking at healthcare affordability, a little bit different of a topic. But again, thank you all for participating. Thank you to attendees for coming, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you,
My
Sean.
pleasure. Good
Thank
to
you,
be with you
everybody.
all.
Bye.
Yeah, take care.